Smith.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's always a pleasure to follow my right honourable friend for Wokingham, who, as ever, spoke with sense and clarity. And I believe that this bill, which is a bill I have been heavily involved with throughout its whole passage, not least sitting on the Bill Committee for 6 months, has been materially improved as we have gone through the process. I'm not saying it's all the way there yet, but it has been materially improved along the way. And I would like to start by thanking my honourable friend for Redditch, the Minister, for the time she has given myself and other honourable and right honourable friends over recent weeks and days in engaging on the substance of this bill. I'd like to start with Lord's Amendment 239, and in particular the government amendment in lieu of it, around removing the restrictions that have perversely persisted over childcare in the system and local government for some time. I won't rehearse the arguments that were well made in this House last night in a general debate led by my honourable friend, the member for Worcester, around the supply and demand challenges of childcare, but I genuinely believe the government's in lieu amendment to 239 will make a big difference going forward on the provision of childcare, which challenges many of our communities. I'd also briefly like to add my voice to the debate around Lord's Amendment 22, this challenging question of virtual meetings in local government. Now, I've said before, and I will maintain my position, that I hate virtual meetings. I can't stand them. I would much rather always meet someone in person. But when this bill talks so much about local decision-making and devolution and letting people decide, where there is that overwhelming demand, the evidence from the National Association of Local Councils shows some 90% of town and parish councils want to have the ability in some way to hold virtual meetings, to expand the ability of people to participate. It is beyond me as to why we cannot, at least in some way, permit and allow that local decision-making to take place. I will briefly give way.
For giving way. On that point, you're making a very good point, and I agree with you. He's making a very good point, and I agree with him entirely. It's really important to expand access to the range of people who have access to become a local councillor. They're not paid to be a full-time councillor, so they need to be given lots of opportunities to get to those meetings and participate fully. And I wondered if you'd agree with me that that's a really important point about expanding representation.
Honourable Lady, for that intervention. I do agree with the fundamental principle of expanding accessibility and the ability for people to take part in local government, particularly those heroes who are completely unpaid, unremunerated for the many hours that they put into town and parish councils around the country. And like her, I represent an entirely rural constituency where often parishes are quite big. When I look back to my own local government days in my 20s, when I was a councillor in a London borough that was actually smaller at 6.1 square miles than every parish in the 335 square miles I'm lucky enough to represent today. We do have to look at the distances involved, even within a parish, that some people have to endure to go to that planning meeting or to get their voice heard on very local issues that their town or parish council are determining. So I would urge my honourable friend on the front bench to reflect on whether there is a way the government can meet local demand when it comes to allowing, at least in part, some virtual access to local democracy. Now, the bulk of this bill is about planning reform, and the lion's share of the amendments we are considering this afternoon, Mr Deputy Speaker, relate to planning reform. It is a bill that will affect literally every community across our entire United Kingdom. And the lens that I want to look at a number of amendments through is the lens that asks, do these amendments support, do nothing to, or hinder the so-called December compromise that my right honourable friend for Surrey Heath, the Secretary of State, agreed with myself and a number of honourable and right honourable friends, not least my right honourable friend for Chipping Barnet and my honourable friend for the Isle of Wight last December. And so I shall start with Lord's Amendment 6, the question of rural proofing. I absolutely and totally support the concept of locking into the face of this bill the concept of rural proofing. But there are a number of points that I would like to ask the front bench to reflect upon whilst making this particular commitment. Because, of course, anybody can say they are going to have regard to anything at all. When I find myself in the supermarket with my children, I could have regard to their demand to only put chocolate, crisps and ice cream in the trolley. It doesn't mean I am necessarily going to actually follow through and have regard to that, in my view, unreasonable demand. And so, given so much of the legislation we pass in this place, it can be judged, and certainly under any legal challenge, it is not unknown for the judiciary to look back at what is said at the dispatch box. I would find it incredibly helpful in summing up if the Minister could expand a little bit on how the government sees that rural proofing. What are the defining principles of that rural proofing that the in lieu amendment to Lord's Amendment 6 talks about? And inextricably linked to that, in my opinion, has to be the content of the new National Planning and Policy Framework. It is a frustration, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that we are unable to see the content of the final text of the NPPF until after this bill achieves royal assent, not least because there are a lot of points that some of us fought very, very hard for during the earlier stages of this bill, which we were promised within the new NPPF, that will help define this question of rural proofing, not least an amendment to the NPPF that I was pleased to secure through my honourable friend, the member for Kensington, which explicitly changes the old language around best and most versatile agricultural land to a very tightly defined and binary question of land used in food production. Because best and most versatile was always a lawyer's paradise, a subjective test that could be argued to the nth degree, whereas changing the wording to land used in food production or protections for land used in food production is binary. It either is or it is not, and that will give clarity to planning authorities up and down the land when considering applications within our rural communities, because a great fear for me is that food security is playing second fiddle to energy security when we see the vast swathes of solar applications and likewise the level of commercial and housing that we are still seeing planning applications for on agricultural land, on land used in food production, and I include within that Category 3B land, which most of my constituency is, that still manages to produce 10 tonne a hectare wheat yields and graze cattle and sheep and produce the food that we all like to eat. And of course, the point I am getting to in this is that I think it is incumbent on the government to recognise within rural proofing that rural needs to remain rural, and without farming, without agriculture, without farmers, there is no rural, because it is the farmers that maintain the landscape, it is the farmers that cut the hedges, it is the farmers that keep our countryside as beautiful as it is. And if you don't have that, it will have the knock-on consequences to everything else that happens in the countryside, not least the backbone of many rural economies, tourism, because if it isn't beautiful and it has all become solar farms or housing or commercial warehouses, then we're not going to get the tourism offer either. So I do encourage the Minister, when they come to the dispatch box later, to give that reassurance to the House around the in lieu amendment to Lord's Amendment 6, that rural proofing really does mean keeping rural rural. I'd now like to turn, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to Lord's Amendment 44. I do have some considerable concern that when so much of the December Compromise was about vesting local decisions in the hands of local authorities, in the hands of local people, where I believe those decisions on planning matters should absolutely be taken, whether it's housing need, whether it's commercial development or developments to do with energy security, that the NDMPs, the National Development Management Policies, are explicitly listed within this bill as having primacy over those local decision-making mechanisms. And I welcome the in lieu amendment that the government has tabled to extend consultation to some degree. My initial preference was that the full parliamentary scrutiny lock that the Lords suggested would have been the preferable measure, and I ask the Minister and the wider government to find a way to absolutely ensure that when we say local decision making is paramount, we really mean local decision making is paramount, and there aren't those get out clauses which, you know, sometimes a statutory consultation simply cannot answer, that we can follow through, because otherwise we're going to set a very dangerous precedent where people put in place their local plans and their neighbourhood plans and they believe that they are in control, but then a national monster comes along in whatever form it takes and walks all over that. The people of Buckinghamshire are all too aware of that with certain infrastructure projects that are being built through the county right now. I never miss an opportunity, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to get that in. Very briefly, I'd also like to associate myself, although he's left his place, with the comments that my right honourable friend for North Somerset made about the Planning Inspectorate, and urge the Minister to consider his comments on that very carefully. Lastly, and this will be the last amendment I speak to, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is Lord's Amendment 80 around flooding. Across Buckinghamshire, across my Buckingham constituency, there have been countless examples of particularly houses built in the floodplain. These are houses that the local authority have turned down, the Planning Inspectorate have granted, then surprise, surprise, when flooding issues have come along, the developer has raised the level of the houses by, in some cases, in excess of a metre, so that when the land does flood, it doesn't flood their new homes that they've just sold, often for in excess of £1 million, but floods the existing houses that surround it. I can think of one example in the village of Ickford in my constituency where that very thing happened, where I even stood in my wellies in the floodwaters before the foundations were dug on this development. They then built them, and surprise, surprise, with these whopping great slopes in the back gardens that lead into the existing homes, as the new owners of those homes start to move in and they start to try and dig their gardens and plant flower beds and all the things that people obviously love to do in their gardens, they're finding that they're hitting layers of rubble and stone very quickly, where the developers have raised the land by that height. So I would urge my honourable friend on the front bench to really consider how we can look at Lord's Amendment 80 much more carefully to properly stop the perversity of house builders being allowed to build in these floodplains, often hiding behind expert evidence that they themselves have paid for and controlled, that it is very difficult to give proper scrutiny to and to disprove, even though everybody in that neighbourhood, everybody in that village or that town or wherever it might be, will tell them absolutely straight down the lens that land floods, and if you build houses on it, those houses will flood too. So in conclusion, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I do think this bill is materially better than when we started last year. I repeat my thanks to my honourable friend the Minister for the engagement she has given, and urge her to push that little bit further to iron out those final gremlins and get this as a bill that communities can be really confident will protect them.